What happens when a loyal dog interrupts a quiet funeral by barking relentlessly at the casket, refusing to be calmed? As a curious stranger steps forward to question the unusual behavior, the priest's nervous demeanor raises suspicion. What follows is an unraveling of secrets that will leave you stunned. The morning was cloaked in a somber gray, as if the skies themselves mourned the loss of Elena Vargas. A light drizzle coated the cobblestone streets of the small village, dampening the already heavy hearts of those gathered. Elena had been a beloved figure, known for her kindness and quiet wisdom, someone who always had time for others despite living a modest and solitary life. The church bell rang out its mournful toll as villagers entered the small stone chapel, clutching handkerchiefs and murmuring condolences. Inside, candles flickered against the stained glass windows, their light casting soft, colorful patterns across the floor. The air was thick with sorrow, the quiet whispers and sniffles blending with the faint creak of pews as people settled into their seats. At the front of the church, near the simple wooden casket, sat Bruno, Elena's loyal German shepherd. His large frame was still, his head resting solemnly on his paws. Everyone knew Bruno as Elena's constant companion, her shadow in life. His presence now, silent and watchful, was a poignant reminder of the bond they had shared. Father Elias, the village priest, stood near the altar, his robes flowing as he prepared to begin the service. He cleared his throat, his voice steady as he recounted Elena's virtues and her impact on the community. Elena was a beacon of kindness, he said, his gaze sweeping the room. She will be greatly missed. For a while, everything proceeded as expected. The atmosphere was heavy but peaceful, a proper tribute to the life of a cherished woman. Then, just as Father Elias began his final prayer, a sharp bark pierced the quiet. Bruno stood up abruptly, his ears perked and his body tense. Another bark followed, louder this time, as the dog moved closer to the casket. Whispers rippled through the congregation, a murmur of confusion and unease. "What's wrong with Bruno?" someone whispered. "He's never behaved like this before," said another. The dog barked again, his eyes fixed on the casket as though he were trying to alert everyone to something unseen. His bark wasn't just loud, it was insistent, almost frantic. The mourners shifted uncomfortably in their seats, exchanging nervous glances. Father Elias, clearly unsettled, attempted to maintain control of the service. "Please, everyone," he said, forcing a smile. "Let us not be distracted. Bruno is likely just—" But before he could finish, Bruno let out a low, guttural growl, his stance becoming more defensive. He began circling the casket, his bark growing sharper and more persistent. It was as if he were guarding something, or warning everyone about it. "What's he doing?" an elderly woman murmured, clutching her rosary tightly. "I've never seen him like this," said another. Father Elias stepped forward, raising a hand to calm the crowd. "It's just a dog," he said, his tone slightly clipped. He approached Bruno cautiously, his other hand extended as if to pacify the animal. "Come now, Bruno, calm down, there's nothing to worry about." But Bruno wasn't deterred. He growled low, his eyes locked on the priest for a moment before returning to the casket. The dog's behavior sent a chill through the room, a creeping sense of unease that no one could shake. Miguel Reyes, a stranger to most of the villagers, sat near the back of the church, observing the scene with growing suspicion. New to the village, Miguel had arrived only a few weeks prior, drawn by its quiet charm and isolated beauty. While he hadn't known Elena personally, he'd heard enough about her to attend the funeral out of respect. Now, as he watched Bruno's unusual behavior and Father Elias's increasingly nervous demeanor, Miguel felt a prickle of curiosity. He leaned forward, his sharp eyes narrowing as he took in the tension between the dog and the priest. "Something's not right," he muttered under his breath. Bruno's barks finally ceased, but the silence that followed was even more unsettling. The dog sat down abruptly, his gaze fixed on the casket, his posture rigid. Miguel rose from his seat, stepping forward hesitantly. "Excuse me, Father," Miguel said, his voice cutting through the quiet. "But does anyone know what's causing the dog to act like this?" Father Elias turned to face him, his smile faltering for a brief moment. "It's nothing, I assure you," he said quickly. Bruno is simply distressed. Dogs can sense. Senses or not, Miguel interrupted. It's clear he's reacting to something specific. The murmurs in the room grew louder. Villagers exchanged looks, some nodding in agreement with Miguel, while others cast wary glances at the priest. Bruno barked once more, a short but commanding sound, as if to affirm Miguel's words. Father Elias's expression hardened slightly, and he raised his hands to silence the crowd. Please, he said firmly, let us focus on honoring Elena's memory. This disruption is unfortunate, but it does not change the solemnity of this occasion. Despite his words, Miguel couldn't ignore the flicker of unease that crossed the priest's face. Nor could he ignore Bruno, who now sat steadfastly beside the casket, refusing to budge. Something about the dog's behavior and the priest's reaction didn't sit right with him. As the funeral resumed, Miguel returned to his seat, but his mind raced with questions. What had Bruno sensed? Why was the priest so insistent on dismissing it? And why did the air in the room feel so charged, as if some hidden truth was waiting to be revealed? Miguel glanced at Bruno, who met his gaze briefly before returning his focus to the casket. The dog's loyalty and determination were undeniable, and Miguel felt a spark of determination ignite within himself. The funeral concluded with an uneasy silence, the mourners dispersing in small, hushed groups. Yet the air remained heavy, weighed down by the lingering echoes of Bruno's barking and the tension it had stirred. Miguel Reyes stood near the edge of the churchyard, his sharp eyes scanning the retreating crowd and the quiet figure of Father Elias, who remained near the altar, avoiding eye contact with anyone. Bruno, ever loyal, had refused to leave Elena's casket even after the service ended. He sat stoically, his ears perked and his gaze unwavering, as if standing vigil over something precious or dangerous. Miguel couldn't shake the sense of unease that had settled in his chest. Something about the priest's demeanor during the service had struck him as odd. Father Elias had been quick to dismiss Bruno's behavior, but Miguel had seen the nervous flicker in his eyes and the tension in his voice. It wasn't the reaction of a man unbothered by a dog's outburst. It was the reaction of someone with something to hide. Later that afternoon, Miguel found himself standing outside the church again, watching as Father Elias supervised the removal of Elena's casket. The priest's composure had returned, but Miguel noticed the way his hands fidgeted, his fingers constantly adjusting his robes or brushing against his face. It was the nervousness of a man trying to appear calm. Gathering his courage, Miguel approached. Bruno, still near the casket, perked up at his presence, letting out a low, welcoming bark. "Excuse me, Father," Miguel began, his tone polite but probing. "I couldn't help but notice how distressed Bruno was during the service. Do you have any idea why he might have reacted that way?" Father Elias turned sharply, his expression tightening for the briefest moment before softening into a practiced smile. "Dogs can be unpredictable creatures," he replied, his voice measured. "Bruno must be grieving. It's not uncommon for animals to act out when they lose someone they love." Miguel nodded slowly but pressed further. "I understand that grief can affect animals, but this felt different. He wasn't just distressed, it seemed like he was trying to tell us something." The priest's smile faltered and his fingers gripped the edge of his robes. "It's best not to read too much into the behavior of a dog," he said tersely. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I have matters to attend to." Miguel watched as Father Elias walked briskly away, his movements stiff and deliberate. Something about the exchange only deepened Miguel's suspicion. The priest's evasiveness wasn't just dismissive, it bordered on defensive. Miguel crouched beside Bruno, running a hand over the dog's sleek coat. "What is it, boy?" he murmured. "What were you trying to tell us back there?" Bruno let out a soft whine, pressing his head against Miguel's hand. His dark eyes, filled with intelligence and sadness, seemed to plead for understanding. Miguel felt a strange connection to the animal, as though they were both outsiders seeking answers. "You know something, don't you?" Miguel said quietly. "And I think I know where to start looking." Bruno's ears perked up at the tone of Miguel's voice, his tail wagging slightly. The dog seemed to sense Miguel's determination, and for the first time that day, Miguel felt like he wasn't entirely alone in his suspicions. As Miguel walked through the village later that evening, he overheard fragments of conversation among the townsfolk. Bruno's behavior had unsettled everyone, sparking whispers and speculation. "I've never seen a dog act like that at a funeral," said an elderly woman to her neighbor. "It's almost as if he saw something we couldn't." "Maybe it's just grief," the neighbor replied, though her tone lacked conviction. "But Father Elias seemed off, don't you think?" Miguel paused, lingering in the shadows as the two women continued their conversation. It wasn't just him, others had noticed the priest's unease as well. "What about Elena's death?" the elderly woman pressed. "Wasn't it strange how the priest was the one who found her, alone in her house, no one around?" Miguel's heart quickened. That detail hadn't been mentioned at the funeral. Why had Elena been alone? And why had Father Elias been the one to find her? That night, Miguel sat in his small rented room, the journal he always carried open on the desk before him. He scribbled notes furiously, his thoughts racing as he pieced together the fragments of the day. Bruno's behavior, unusual, persistent, directed at the casket. Father Elias's reaction, nervous, dismissive, actively avoided the casket. Elena's death, circumstances unclear. Why was she alone? Why was the priest the first to find her? Bruno lay curled at Miguel's feet, his steady breathing the only sound in the room. Miguel glanced down at the dog, a sense of resolve hardening in his chest. "I don't know what's going on," Miguel murmured, "but I'm going to find out. For Elena. And for you." Bruno stirred at the sound of his name, lifting his head to look at Miguel. His eyes gleamed with a quiet determination that matched Miguel's own. The next morning, Miguel stood in front of Elena's small stone cottage, nestled at the edge of the village. Overgrown weeds crept along the path to the door, and the once vibrant garden was now a tangle of wildflowers and brambles. It was a quiet place, steeped in the memories of the woman who had lived there alone. Bruno trotted ahead, his tail wagging slightly as he sniffed the air, then paused at the door. He looked back at Miguel expectantly, as if urging him to step inside. "All right, boy," Miguel murmured, pushing the door open. "Let's see what we can find." The air inside was thick with dust, carrying the faint scent of lavender, a memory of Elena's presence. The sunlight streaming through the grimy windows illuminated a small, tidy living room with shelves lined with books and knickknacks. Miguel moved cautiously, careful not to disturb anything more than necessary. Bruno followed closely, sniffing the corners of the room and occasionally letting out a low whine. On a side table near the window, Miguel noticed a framed photograph of Elena with Bruno. She looked serene, her kind eyes gazing out from behind the glass. Next to it was an open book, its pages yellowed and marked with notes in delicate handwriting. "Elena," Miguel said softly, running his fingers over the edge of the book, "what were you trying to tell us?" He began to search the room more thoroughly, opening drawers and examining the objects on the shelves. Most of what he found were ordinary items. A sewing kit, an old radio, a tin of loose tea leaves. But it was in a small wooden chest, tucked beneath the sofa, that he discovered something unusual. Inside the chest was a collection of letters tied together with a faded blue ribbon and a leather-bound journal. Miguel's fingers trembled slightly as he untied the ribbon, careful not to damage the fragile paper. The journal was filled with Elena's neat handwriting, the ink smudged in places as though she'd written hastily or with great emotion. Miguel began reading, his heart pounding as he absorbed the words. "I've seen things I shouldn't have. Father Elias is not who he seems. He's hiding something, and I fear what he might do if he knows I've found out. The donations, they're disappearing. The money isn't going where it's supposed to. I followed him to the church late at night, but I haven't been able to see what he's doing. I found a box. It's hidden beneath the statue of St. Matthias in the church. I don't know what's inside, but I believe it holds the answers." Miguel's grip on the journal tightened. The entries painted a picture of a woman consumed by fear and determination, risking everything to uncover the truth. Her words were a plea for help, a call to action that now fell on Miguel's shoulders. As he turned the pages, a small object fell from between the sheets, a key taped to the back of a photograph. Miguel held it up, examining it closely. It was an old-fashioned brass key, the kind that might open a lockbox or a small door. The photograph showed Elena standing with Father Elias in front of the church. Her expression was tight, her smile forced, as if she'd been compelled to take the picture. In her hand, partially hidden, was a corner of what appeared to be a metal box, the very box she'd mentioned in her journal. Miguel's mind raced. The key and the journal were pieces of a puzzle pointing him towards something deeper, something dangerous. Bruno let out a low bark, drawing Miguel's attention. The dog was standing near a shelf, pawing at a pile of books. Miguel crouched beside him, pulling the books away to reveal a hidden compartment in the wall. Inside was a small folded map with a red circle marking a spot in the church. Scrawled in Elena's handwriting were the words, "The truth lies here." Miguel stared at the map, his heart pounding. The trail was clear now, the pieces falling into place. He looked at Bruno, who wagged his tail in approval. "You're right, boy," Miguel said, tucking the map and journal into his bag. It's time to visit the church. As Miguel left the cottage, he felt a mix of fear and determination. Elena had been brave enough to confront the darkness within the community, and now it was his turn to continue her work. The journal's warnings echoed in his mind, but so did its urgency. He glanced down at Bruno, who walked beside him with unwavering loyalty. "We'll find out the truth," Miguel said, his voice firm. "Whatever it takes." The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows over the village as Miguel and Bruno made their way toward the church. The air felt heavier now, as though the village itself was holding its breath, waiting for the secrets buried within its heart to be uncovered. The church stood quiet and imposing in the moonlight, its tall steeple reaching toward the sky like a silent sentinel. Miguel approached cautiously, Bruno by his side, the journal and key tucked safely in his coat. Every step closer felt like venturing into forbidden territory, the air thick with an inexplicable tension. "This is it, boy," Miguel whispered, placing a hand on Bruno's head. The dog gazed up at him with a mix of determination and trust, as if ready for whatever lay ahead. The church doors creaked as Miguel pushed them open, their sound echoing through the empty sanctuary. The faint scent of incense lingered in the air, mingling with the mustiness of old wood and stone. Moonlight filtered through the stained glass windows, casting fragmented colors onto the pews. Miguel's eyes scanned the room, searching for the statue Elena had described in her journal. It wasn't hard to spot. The statue of Saint Matthias stood in the corner, its solemn expression carved in stone. Miguel approached slowly, his heart pounding in his chest. "This is where she said it was," he murmured, crouching beside the statue. Miguel ran his hands along the base of the statue, feeling for any loose panels or hidden compartments. Bruno sniffed the ground nearby, letting out an occasional low whine as if sensing the importance of the moment. Finally, Miguel's fingers brushed against a small latch concealed in the statue's base. His breath caught as he pressed it, and with a soft click, a hidden panel slid open, revealing a metal box nestled inside. Miguel carefully pulled the box out, its weight heavier than he expected. The cold metal glinted faintly in the dim light. He sat back on his heels, staring at the box, its presence confirming Elena's suspicions. Bruno nudged Miguel's arm with his nose as if urging him to open it. "All right, let's see what's inside," Miguel said, pulling the key from his coat. His hands trembled slightly as he inserted the key into the lock and turned it. The box creaked open, revealing its contents. Inside were stacks of money, donations from the congregation, each bundle labeled with the names of those who had given them. Beneath the money was a ledger filled with detailed records of financial transactions. As Miguel flipped through the pages, his stomach turned. The ledger listed sums of money far beyond what the church would need for its upkeep, with cryptic notes about where the excess funds were being funneled. At the very bottom of the box lay a map similar to the one Miguel had found in Elena's home. This one marked a specific location within the church, a secret storage room. The sound of footsteps shattered the heavy silence, and Miguel's head snapped up. Father Elias stood in the doorway, his face pale and his hands gripping the doorframe tightly. "What are you doing?" the priest demanded, his voice low and dangerous. Miguel rose to his feet, holding the box tightly. "I think the better question is what you've been doing, Father." The priest's eyes flickered to the box, his expression hardening. "That doesn't belong to you. Put it back." "Does it belong to you?" Miguel countered, stepping forward. "These are the people's donations, their trust, and you've been stealing it." Father Elias's face twisted with fury. "You don't understand what you're talking about. Put it down before you make things worse." Miguel held his ground, his voice steady. "Worse for you, you mean? This ledger tells a story, Father. And Elena, she knew. She knew what you were doing, and you tried to silence her." The priest's composure cracked. He lunged toward Miguel, his hands reaching for the box. Bruno reacted instantly, placing himself between Miguel and the priest, growling fiercely. "Call off that dog!" Father Elias shouted, his voice shaking. Miguel stepped back, keeping the box out of reach. "Not until you tell me the truth. Where's Elena?" Father Elias hesitated, his eyes darting toward the door leading to the church's basement. That fleeting glance was all Miguel needed. Miguel's heart raced as he pieced it together. "She's here, isn't she?" he demanded. "You didn't just take her money, you took her life away." The priest's face turned ashen and he took a step back. "You don't know what you're doing. Leave now, or you'll regret it." Miguel crouched beside Bruno, placing the metal box on the ground. "We're not leaving until we find her. Bruno, let's go." Bruno barked sharply, his tail wagging as if to say, "I'm ready." Together, they turned toward the basement door, the weight of the box's secrets driving them forward. Behind them, Father Elias's panicked voice echoed through the church, but Miguel didn't look back. He knew they were close to uncovering the truth, no matter how dark it might be. The basement door creaked open with an unsettling groan, revealing a steep, narrow staircase that descended into darkness. Miguel hesitated for a moment, gripping the flashlight he had found earlier. Bruno stood at his side, his body tense but unwavering. "Stay close, boy," Miguel whispered, his voice barely audible over the sound of his own heartbeat. The air grew colder as they descended, the faint scent of damp earth and mildew mingling with something more metallic, a hint of blood, perhaps. Each step felt like crossing into a forbidden realm, the weight of the metal box and Elena's journal in Miguel's satchel adding to the heaviness in the air. At the bottom of the stairs, the faint glow of a flickering bulb illuminated a damp, narrow corridor. The walls were rough stone, and puddles of water dotted the floor. Miguel's footsteps echoed softly, his senses heightened by the oppressive silence. Bruno sniffed the ground, his movements deliberate, leading Miguel to a heavy wooden door at the end of the corridor. A faint sound emerged from behind it, a soft, rhythmic clinking, like metal brushing against metal. Miguel placed his hand on the door, pushing it open slowly. His breath caught as the dim light revealed a small, shadowy room. In the center sat a frail figure, her hands bound by thick chains that rattled softly as she moved. "Elena!" Miguel exclaimed, rushing forward. The elderly woman's head lifted weakly at the sound of her name. Her face was pale, her eyes sunken but filled with a glimmer of recognition. "Miguel," she murmured, her voice hoarse. You found me." Miguel bent down, examining the chains. "We're going to get you out of here," he said, his voice steady despite the anger boiling within him. Before he could act further, heavy footsteps echoed down the corridor behind him. Miguel spun around to see Father Elias standing in the doorway, his face contorted with rage. In his hands he held a wooden plank, gripping it tightly. "You shouldn't have come here," Elias growled, his voice dripping with venom. "You don't understand. You've ruined everything." Miguel straightened, shielding Elena with his body. "Everything? You mean your lies, your theft, and your betrayal? That's what I've ruined?" Father Elias lunged forward, swinging the plank. Miguel dodged just in time, the wood smashing against the wall. Bruno leapt into action, barking ferociously and positioning himself between Miguel and the priest. "Call off that dog!" Elias shouted, his composure unraveling. "No," Miguel said coldly. "You're not getting away with this." The priest swung the plank again, aiming for Miguel, but Bruno intervened, lunging at Elias and sinking his teeth into the man's arm. Elias let out a howl of pain, dropping the plank as he tried to shake the dog off. Bruno held firm, growling with ferocity. Miguel took advantage of the distraction, grabbing the plank and using it to knock Elias backward. The priest stumbled, clutching his wounded arm, but his fury remained undiminished. "You have no idea what you've done," Elias spat, his voice filled with desperation. "You think you're saving her, but you're only destroying the balance." Miguel ignored his ramblings, focusing on Elena. "We're getting out of here," he said, grabbing the chain binding her wrists. He searched for a way to free her, his hands trembling with urgency. Elias lunged again, this time grabbing Miguel by the collar. The two men struggled, the sound of their scuffle echoing in the confined space. Bruno barked wildly, his loyalty unwavering as he circled the fight. With a surge of strength, Miguel managed to shove Elias against the wall, pinning him there. "Why, Elias? Why do this to her? To them?" Miguel demanded, his voice filled with anger. The priest's eyes darted wildly, his face pale. "You don't understand. This village, it owes me. I've sacrificed everything for them, and this is how they repay me? Elena was going to ruin everything. I couldn't let her." Suddenly, the sound of voices echoed down the corridor. The villagers, drawn by the commotion, had followed the noise to the basement. One by one, they entered the room, their expressions shifting from confusion to horror as they took in the scene. Elena, chained and frail. Father Elias, disheveled and furious. Miguel standing defiantly with the plank in his hands. What is this?" one villager stammered. Miguel stepped forward, his voice steady. "This is your priest. This is what he's been hiding." He opened the metal box, revealing the stolen money and the ledger. Gasps filled the room as the villagers realized the extent of Elias's betrayal. "He's been stealing from you," Miguel continued, his tone unwavering. "And when Elena discovered the truth, he locked her away to silence her." The crowd murmured, their shock turning to anger. Some stepped forward, grabbing Elias by the arms to restrain him. The priest's protests were drowned out by the collective outrage of the villagers. Miguel turned back to Elena, his hands working quickly to remove her chains. "You're safe now," he said softly as the last shackle fell away. Elena slumped forward, her strength nearly gone, but a faint smile graced her lips. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Bruno nudged her gently, his tail wagging as if to reassure her that the danger was over. Elena reached out a trembling hand to stroke his fur, her gratitude evident in her eyes. The villagers helped Miguel lift Elena, supporting her as they made their way back upstairs. The light of the sanctuary was blinding after the darkness of the basement, but it felt like a new beginning, a symbol of truth brought into the light. As the villagers handed Elias over to the authorities, Miguel stood with Elena and Bruno at the church steps. The crowd was somber but united, their betrayal tempered by a newfound resolve to rebuild their community on honesty and trust. "You did it," Elena said weakly, her voice filled with gratitude. "You uncovered the truth." Miguel shook his head. "We did it," he replied, glancing down at Bruno, who wagged his tail happily. "And now it's time to heal." The sun hung low in the sky as the villagers gathered in the church square, their voices filled with a mix of anger, disbelief, and determination. Father Elias stood in the center, his hands bound, his once respected figure now stripped of its authority. His face was pale, his eyes darting between the villagers who had trusted him and the evidence of his crimes laid bare. Miguel stepped forward, holding the metal box and Elena's journal. Beside him stood Bruno, his tail wagging slightly but his demeanor alert. Elena, though frail, stood on Miguel's other side, supported by a kind neighbor who had brought her a warm shawl. Her presence brought both relief and anger to the crowd. Relief that she was alive, and anger at what she had endured. Miguel raised the metal box high, his voice clear and steady as he addressed the crowd. "This is what your priest has been hiding from you. Your donations, your trust. He stole it all and used it for his own gain." Gasps and murmurs rippled through the crowd as Miguel opened the box, showing the bundles of stolen money. He then held up Elena's journal, flipping through the pages to reveal her meticulous notes about Father Elias's activities. Elena discovered the truth, he continued. She tried to protect this community by uncovering his lies, and for that she was imprisoned. The villagers' expressions shifted from shock to outrage. One woman stepped forward, her voice trembling with emotion. "We trusted you, Father Elias. You were supposed to guide us, not betray us." Another man shook his head, his fist clenched. "And you dared to call yourself a man of God while committing these sins?" Father Elias tried to speak, his voice faltering. "You don't understand. I did it for the greater good. The church needed the funds, and Elena, she would have destroyed everything." "Destroyed what?" Miguel shot back, his voice sharp. "Your lies, your greed. You used faith as a shield to justify your crimes, and you hurt the very people who looked to you for guidance." Amid the tension, Bruno barked once, drawing everyone's attention. The villagers, already moved by Miguel's bravery, turned their eyes to the loyal dog who had refused to let the truth remain hidden. A child broke from the crowd and ran to Bruno, throwing his arms around the dog's neck. "You're a hero, Bruno," the boy exclaimed, his voice ringing with admiration. The crowd began to murmur their agreement, smiles breaking through the heavy atmosphere as they realized how instrumental Bruno had been. "Elena is alive because of Bruno," another villager said. "He sensed something was wrong when none of us did." A cheer went up for the dog, who wagged his tail enthusiastically, basking in the attention. Miguel knelt beside him, scratching behind his ears. "You've earned this, boy," he said with a smile. The local authorities arrived shortly after, summoned by a messenger from the village. Two officers approached Father Elias, their expressions grim. "Father Elias, you are under arrest for embezzlement, false imprisonment, and other charges to be determined." As the officers led him away, Elias's bravado crumbled. "You don't understand," he shouted, his voice cracking. "I'm the only one who can keep this village together. Without me, you're nothing." Miguel shook his head, watching as the priest was taken into custody. "This village is stronger than you ever gave it credit for," he said softly. "We'll be fine without you." The crowd parted to let the officers pass, their expressions a mix of relief and lingering sadness. They had lost someone they once trusted, but they had also gained a renewed sense of purpose and unity. As the crowd began to disperse, neighbors approached Elena, offering her words of comfort and promises of help. "We'll make sure you're cared for," one woman said, her hand resting gently on Elena's shoulder. "You've done so much for us, even when we didn't see it." Elena smiled faintly, her voice weak but steady. "Thank you. All I ever wanted was to protect this village." Miguel stepped closer, placing a reassuring hand on her arm. "You've done more than that, Elena. You've shown everyone what it means to stand up for the truth." Bruno barked again, his tail wagging as if to emphasize Miguel's words. The villagers chuckled softly, their spirits beginning to lift. That evening, the church square remained alive with quiet conversations and plans for the future. The villagers discussed how to handle the aftermath of Elias's betrayal, resolving to rebuild their community on a foundation of transparency and trust. Miguel stood with Elena and Bruno on the steps of the church, watching the scene with a sense of accomplishment. For the first time in what felt like ages, the village seemed united, their shared determination stronger than the shadow Elias had cast. "You've brought them hope again," Elena said softly, her voice tinged with gratitude. "Thank you, Miguel." Miguel shook his head, his gaze steady. "You're the one who fought for them, Elena. I just helped finish what you started." As the last of the villagers departed for their homes, the square grew quiet, illuminated by the soft glow of the street lamps. Miguel knelt beside Bruno, scratching behind his ears once more. "Looks like we've earned a rest, buddy," he said with a smile. Bruno wagged his tail, leaning into Miguel's touch. Together, they watched the village settle into peace, knowing they had played a part in bringing it back to life. The morning after the dramatic events, a sense of calm enveloped the village. The tension of the previous days had lifted, leaving behind a renewed sense of community and purpose. The square, which had been the epicenter of chaos, now buzzed quietly with the sounds of villagers repairing what was broken, not just physically but emotionally. Elena sat on the porch of her small cottage, a blanket wrapped around her shoulders to protect her from the cool morning breeze. The weight of her ordeal was evident in her frail frame, but her eyes held a glimmer of peace. Beside her, Bruno sat faithfully, his head resting on her lap as she absently stroked his fur. Miguel approached the cottage carrying a basket of freshly picked fruit and bread, a small gesture from the villagers who had rallied around Elena after the truth was revealed. "Good morning," he greeted with a warm smile. "How are you feeling today?" Elena looked up, her face softening. "Better," she said, her voice steady. "Thanks to you and Bruno, of course." Miguel chuckled, crouching to scratch Bruno behind the ears. "I think Bruno deserves the real credit. He's the one who wouldn't let us ignore what was happening." Elena's hand paused mid-stroke, her expression turning serious. "I owe you both my life," she said quietly. "You didn't have to get involved, but you did. You stood up for the truth when it would have been easier to walk away." Miguel shook his head. "You deserve to be saved, Elena. And this village deserved to know the truth." As the days passed, Miguel and Bruno became fixtures in the village. Miguel's curiosity and kindness endeared him to the residents, who often stopped by Elena's cottage to check on her and share their plans for rebuilding. Children flocked to Bruno, feeding him treats and playing games in the yard. He had become a hero, and the villagers treated him as such. One afternoon, Miguel stood with Elena overlooking a small group of villagers who were repainting the church doors. Their laughter and camaraderie were a stark contrast to the tense silence that had once filled the square. "You've brought them back together," Elena said softly. "For a while I thought this village was broken beyond repair. But now I see hope again." Miguel glanced at her, his gaze thoughtful. "It wasn't me. This community was always strong, they just needed to be reminded of it." Elena smiled, the lines on her face softening. "Will you stay?" she asked. "The village could use someone like you. And Bruno, of course." Miguel considered her words, his hand resting on Bruno's head. He had come to the village as a stranger, but it no longer felt that way. These people had embraced him, and in return he had found a purpose he hadn't known he was searching for. "I think we'll stay," he said with a nod. "There's something special here, and I'd like to be part of it." That evening, the villagers gathered in the square for a small celebration. Lanterns hung from trees, casting a warm glow over the crowd as laughter and conversation filled the air. Elena sat at the center, her presence a testament to resilience and courage. Miguel stood beside her, a quiet smile on his face as he watched Bruno weave through the crowd, basking in the attention. One of the villagers raised a glass, calling for silence. "To Elena, Miguel, and Bruno," he said, his voice ringing out, "for showing us that even in the darkest times, truth and loyalty can light the way." Cheers erupted, and Miguel felt a swell of emotion in his chest. He had come to the village as an outsider, but now he was part of something greater, a community bound by shared values and a commitment to rebuild. As the celebration continued, Miguel turned to Elena. "Do you think things will ever be the same again?" he asked. Elena shook her head gently. "No," she said. "But maybe that's a good thing. We've seen what can happen when people look the other way. Now we know better, and we'll be better." Miguel nodded, her words resonating deeply. He looked out over the village, its people united in their determination to protect one another. It wasn't perfect, but it was a beginning, a chance to start anew. Later that night, as the festivities wound down and the villagers returned to their homes, Miguel stood on the edge of the square with Bruno at his side. The stars twinkled above, casting a serene light over the village. He knelt beside Bruno, his hand resting on the dog's neck. "We did it, boy," he murmured. "We helped them find the truth." Bruno wagged his tail, leaning into Miguel's touch. The bond between them was unspoken, but unbreakable, forged through shared courage and determination. As Miguel rose to his feet, he glanced back at the village, now quiet and peaceful. A sense of fulfillment washed over him, accompanied by a quiet resolve. Whatever challenges lay ahead, He knew they would face them together, united by the truth and strengthened by the loyalty of a dog who refused to let injustice go unnoticed. This story is a testament to the power of loyalty, courage, and standing up for what's right, even when it's difficult. It reminds us that every voice matters and that justice begins when someone dares to seek the truth. If this story inspired you, let us know in the comments below. What would you have done in Miguel's place? Share your thoughts, and let's keep the conversation going. And don't forget, hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and ring the notification bell to stay connected for more heartfelt and inspiring stories like this one. Together, let's spread hope and positivity.